is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined today by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Patting the Poodle at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
No burying the lead there, Luke. Good evening, gentlemen. I'm here on Gadigal country, and it's not just me joining the pod on Gadigal country. I've got my little fur baby sitting on my lap, otherwise known as Chewy, who refused to sit quietly in a corner somewhere. So he's a pod lapdog tonight.
Yes, the fabled fourth co-host of the Let Me Sum Up podcast. Welcome, Chewy. And a man who we just woke up because he had fallen asleep in the back seat of the Tesla as it rolls along on the interminable road trip that is the journey towards the release of the Australian government's carbon leakage review. Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Throwing my own words back against me, my own metaphor. Never thought I'd see the day. Et you, Luke. Et you.
Well, Tennant, you claimed that the carbon leakage review was in the boot of the car last episode,
Yes.
implying this road trip is not to the review, which is already in the car, but to the launch of the review. Do you care to comment on the internal consistency of this metaphor?
I assert to you that the metaphor is alive and well, as is the carbon leakage review, and that some bright day, maybe very soon, maybe not quite so very soon, but definitely happening, that second report is going to come out, and those of us who are busy bees will spend a lot of time responding to it. I think we are getting to the point, given that as we record, it is just past the middle of August, and originally the final recommendations of this review were due to be tendered unto government at the end of September. I think the timelines are going to slip back.
Reckon?
I do. Because per my comment last episode, this is a topic that does need genuinely deep consultation. And once there is a thing to react to, people are going to need a lot of time to stroke their chins and mutter about trade policy and industrial policy and climate policy and come to some conclusions. And I look forward to that experience.
I mean, it's a good thing it was like publicised on a website and all of that. Otherwise, I'd be starting to think this whole thing was a figment of Tennant's imagination. He's just trying to manifest it into
Well, now
reality.
I think about it, Frankie, everything I know about the carbon leakage review has come from Tennant. Verbally.
Oh, no.
And everything I know about the carbon leakage review came from my friend Harvey, a 6-foot-tall invisible rabbit. But he's very reliable, I can tell you.
Well, why don't you snuggle back under the blanket, champ, and we'll wake you up in a couple of weeks. On this week's show, we dig into a recent global survey of climate change litigation and consider how it is aiding, and in some cases impeding, action to reduce emissions. But first, as the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide, much hinges on China's success in curbing its carbon emissions. The good news is that emissions were down 1% in the second quarter of 2024, a result that some analysts cite as evidence that China is on track to dramatically outperform its goal of peaking its emissions in 2030. Indeed, there are those that suggest that if 2024 plays out as expected, China's year of peak emissions may have already happened back in 2023. Tennant, that would be pretty big news, but there are a lot of factors at play here. What are the numbers telling us?
Yeah, so these numbers, which have been put together by Lauri Miliverta, an extremely well-respected long-time China watcher, used to be with Greenpeace in China. Now he does global emissions and clean air monitoring, but with a particular focus on China. He's put this together both from the material that China's National Bureau of Statistics puts out and a number of other data sets. Not everybody fully trusts official statistics out of China, but Lauri is a very experienced consumer and cross-checker of Chinese data. That said, it's pretty confusingly complex data. There are things pushing in different directions inside China's economy. I mean, the biggest factors here are that the growth of clean energy is enormous in China, just a huge, 22% year-on-year growth in China's production of renewable energy, excluding hydro and nuclear. Hydro rebounded this year from low levels last year. So 22% year-on-year growth in wind and solar, and renewables are meeting more than a third of electricity demand, which is quite big. But overall energy demand has been rising a lot too. And so it looks like, it all depends on what happens in the second half of the year. There is an expected slowdown in energy demand growth. If that does come about, then overall China's emissions will fall for the year. If that demand growth continues and the pattern of China's economic model is still very much emphasising growth in supply in the manufacturing sector now, much more so than the construction sector, if the rate of growth there continues, then emissions will just be flat for the year, despite all that enormous growth in renewables. And then underneath that, there's even more stories within the manufacturing sector. There's been, a lot of growth, a lot in production of electric vehicles and solar photovoltaics and batteries. And those things have emissions in production, but they enable a lot of emissions reductions. There's other things growing too. So China's coal to chemicals sector, which is a domestically energy secure alternative to petrochemicals, but has much higher emissions than using oil, that grew its coal demand 21% last year.
That's huge.
It's gigantic.
Is that just off a low base because of the depressed demand through COVID, or is that quite a significant growth compared to pre-COVID years?
It looks like a significant growth. Yes, Chewy, that's right. It's a big deal. And it is substantial growth and driven by coal prices falling from a period when they were relatively high compared to oil. The analysis makes the point, and this is published in Carbon Brief, an excellent website associated with friend of the podcast, Simon Evans. If there is not a cap on overall emissions in China, that kind of offsetting emissions growth elsewhere in the economy can very easily sap and maybe even outweigh the growth in clean energy. So that makes the forthcoming policy moves that have been flagged in China recently a big deal.
When I was reading that very excellent article in Carbon Brief, I didn't get a sense of the sort of depressed demand for construction, whether that's a structural kind of downshift and we could expect that out into the future. I guess the comment in the article made it seem like it was more of a temporary decline. And I mean, separately to this, I've read a lot about companies going bust in China over construction, oversupply, particularly in the resi apartment market. So it's not surprising to me that those figures are down. But I didn't have a clear sense of whether, this is all temporary, or you could expect some of that big demand because it goes to concrete and steel and other, emissions-intensive activities, whether that's expected to kind of bounce back up in the next couple of years.
So I would be very surprised if there were any sustained recovery in China's construction sector and property sector. It really looks like property prices still have further to fall, and it would be very hard to get going again that dynamic of speculative growth in property once the bubble of, the value's just going to keep going up has been burst. There was a lot of toing and froing about this among Chinese policymakers over the past 18 months or so, but I don't think that property is coming back anytime soon.
I just went and looked up some figures from Oxford Economics on that. They reckon the resi building work was down, or should be down 2.5% this year, but non-resi building work is forecast to go down 21.6% this year.
Yeah.
That's huge. Anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a nerdy point, but those kinds of things matter a lot when you're talking about those big demand pull-throughs for materials.
Yes. And a matter of some interest to Australia.
Yes, indeed. Has big implications for some of our export industries. I think it's worth just always pausing when we grapple with the transition that's underway in China, and just the scale is mind-boggling. So there's one dot point in this very extensive article that just it is a bracing number, which is that electricity generation from wind and solar grew by 171 terawatt hours in the first half of the year, which is more than the total power output of the UK in the same period of 2023. And indeed, Australia, Australian generation in 2023 was, 270 odd terawatt hours, so easily eclipses a 6-month period. It just reminds you just how significant an economy China is, but also just the scale on which shifts, once they get moving, can take place.
Yeah.
The other one that jumped out at me was an important data point on the amount of emissions in the Chinese context that are associated with manufacturing of solar panels and EVs and batteries. Only 1.6% of China's electricity consumption and 2.9% of its emissions in the first half of 2024. That's an important number to track, but has to be weighed against the emissions reductions, the operational emissions reductions that are being enabled by the ramp up of that sector, right?
Yeah. And China is its own biggest customer for those products, for all the angst in many Western markets and economies about being so dependent on Chinese capacity for manufacturing those things. They are mostly being consumed or installed in China, and they are making a big difference. Oil demand is falling and in China, and the uptake in EVs, where they have eclipsed sales of internal combustion engine vehicles for the first time this year. That's counting battery EVs and hybrids and plug-in hybrids. But things are changing there very rapidly. And they better, because China is such a huge driver of global emissions.
And so I guess the commitment that they've had for a while is that they would peak emissions by 2030. And this analysis, a few, I guess, analysts out there are suggesting that may well have already happened. Is it too early to be telling that? I mean, when do you think we'd have a sense of this more definitively?
Well, I mean, only I think once the decline has gone far enough that it would be just physically hard for it to be surpassed with one bad year of say a reversion to very energy and emissions intensive stimulus. During a hypothetical further slowdown in the next couple of years. It is brave to make that call now. I think if you read all the asterisks and the detail, you do get a more nuanced sense of, even if it is not this year but next year, when the peak can be called, there are really dramatic changes in the Chinese energy system that are heading in the right direction, albeit not as fast as you'd want for any kind of shot at 1.5 degrees without overshoot. and even with overshoot.
I mean, I find it interesting, the approach that China is taking to, given the direction of travel, not sort of shouting it from the rooftops. They're being very circumspect in claiming this as an impending win, whether that comes up in the context of forthcoming NDCs or how they choose to use the likelihood that they will be able to pull forward that commitment around peaking emissions in 2030. It's quite a chip in the global game of climate negotiations.
Yes.
So would we expect to hear much at COP this year? Or I think we're still kind of waiting for that first quarter next year time frame for 2035 NDCs, right?
Yeah, and for updating their 2031, possibly with a statement that, we did peak. We will see about that. But yes, I think they'll keep us waiting a little bit longer. There's just one other thing from this report that I wanted to highlight, which is that China sometimes has a reputation as an incredibly far-sighted, sort of astutely investing in the industries of the future state. And I think it's important to recognise that alongside some of that stuff, and maybe actually just a manifestation of some of the same trends and pathologies, the Chinese state can do some super dumb stuff too, like not just morally objectionable things that we can all call to mind, but one of the things that there's a policy push on is cleaning up its coal generation fleet, not by shutting parts of it down, although there has been some of that, but by doing their own version of a clean coal push, trying to get a tranche of coal plants to reduce emissions 20% and then another tranche to reduce emissions by 50% using some combination of co-firing biomass and co-firing ammonia in these plants.
Oof.
And this is dopey. Because they're not going to have enough biomass to send it up in smoke. And ammonia is going to be super expensive to apply for that purpose. And it's just a sort of a way of – it's a step on the stages of grieving towards recognising that a lot of the capital sunk into new coal-fired power stations over the past decade and still going on today is just – wasted capital. That stuff is going to be written off and stranded, like a lot of other investments in China, which is a country that structurally overinvests in anything and everything at the expense of consumption, which they really need to rebalance towards, say, wiser heads than mine.
All right. Shall we chat about a report?
Yeah.
We should.
Where China is maybe the great silence.
Yeah.
Attempts to use the legal system to drive stronger climate action is nothing new. However, over the last decade, the number of cases against governments and corporations has skyrocketed, and the legal strategies underpinning these actions have become increasingly diverse. It is a rapidly evolving area, but luckily we've been provided with a snapshot in a new report titled Global Trends in Climate Change Litigation from the London School of Economics. In it, the authors dig into the two broad categories of litigation in this area, cases that are aligned with meeting our climate goals and cases that, intentionally or otherwise, result in slower progress on climate action. Frankie, sometime co-host of the podcast, Alison Reeve, put this paper on our radar. What did you and Chewy make of it?
I can't speak for the lapdog, but I'm glad Alison put it on our reading list because I found this fascinating, like really fascinating reading. It looks as though they do these snapshots maybe on an annual basis. So certainly did one last year, and it's just a very methodical sort of dissection of the kinds of strategies that you see different forms of climate litigation take, and some really good kind of analysis and commentary on the trends that they see within those different categories. And I hope we get to talk about some of those. But then I guess the sort of upfront writ large bit of it is litigation is spread across a lot of countries in the world, very much dominated in the global north, not so much the south. And even within that, like the US has the vast lion's share of cases that we're talking about, something in the order of 1,700.
Notoriously litigious United States of America.
Yes.
In all areas, including in climate change.
Although, I mean, I know we just watched the Olympics and we're all about gold here in Australia, but we're sort of claiming a silver medal in having the second highest concentration of climate litigation here.
That was remarkable when I saw that. Taking out the silver medal, second on the podium, Australia, although they do say that they didn't see a lot of action logged in 2023 on the Australian front, only 6 cases, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And presumably, I know a lot of that is around project approvals on fossil fuel projects and things. So I'm sure we'll get into that. Concentrated in the US. Also, what's useful to note here as well is that most cases are brought against governments and by not-for-profits and sort of prominent individuals. But there is a trend to have more litigation against corporates and sort of especially prevalent in some of the more emerging areas of focus that look at transition risk litigation and climate washing, so a form of greenwashing, and a push around turning off the taps, which is around challenging finance to sort of non-climate aligned activities. So there was a lot to unpack in all of this. Maybe what's good is to just step out the different categories because they go through the sort of trends and the prominent cases, I guess, that happened in 2023 in all of these areas. One of the ones I found the most interesting, and it's the first one on the list, is the government framework category.
Yeah.
And that's, basically NGOs, not-for-profits taking the government to court saying your policies are not good enough, they're not aligned with either the Paris Agreement or net zero and consistent with that 1.5 degree future. And there was a really significant case that was sort of brought and had a decision this year, and that was the European Court of Human Rights decision in the case of Klima. I'm going to get this wrong. Klima Signorinen.
Sounds great.
I think that's pretty good.
You're
Swiss.
There's Switzerland.
The climate seniors, right?
Yeah.
I didn't look.
Climate senior ladies.
I didn't look it up. I probably should have. Yes. So, it confirmed that the government's failure to act on climate change constitutes a violation of the European Convention on Human Rights, and the country has been made to up its targets, basically. And what was super interesting as well, and I don't know if you had that light bulb moment, Luke, but they also reference a similar case that happened in Germany. It wasn't in this year's tally, but it was noted as significant and having influenced other cases that have been brought since. And I remembered when you and I had been in Berlin having these meetings with policymakers, they were telling us about their Climate Change Protection Act and that there was a challenge to it in the courts. They'd even observed to us that they didn't think they were on track to meet the targets, some of the sectoral targets that they'd set, notably in buildings, and I couldn't remember if they'd flagged transport. But that turned out to be one of the other cases where the plaintiffs won and the German government had to up its targets as well. Which is nuts. We haven't seen that kind of litigation in Australia yet, have we?
No.
We haven't. And it's actually useful drawing that contrast because there's kind of, in these kind of, these sorts of cases, which is kind of challenging the fundamentals of government action, and whether it is appropriately stepping up to the plate and dealing with these climate issues. You've got categories where there's actually legislation in place. Legislative target, sectoral targets in the case of Germany. You had a similar situation in the UK recently. And the challenge is to whether the government is appropriately meeting the objectives of the legislation. And so they've set a framework themselves versus some of these other cases. And the case in Switzerland is an example of something which is leveraging off a human rights framework. In other cases, you see litigation that seeks to read into national or state constitutions and rights that have been enshrined therein to kind of make the case that they're not being upheld because of a failure to act on climate change. There's these various pathways in. Some of them are reading into existing statutes or legal frameworks. Others are kind of leveraging explicit climate-themed legislation that has been put in place by governments, but all to the same end.
And there were some really interesting observations in the report, which is compiled by US legal and climate academics using global and US-based databases that seem to have some limitations in what they cover and what they don't. That in the specific case, Klima Signorinen, the court was quite careful to make distinctions between its role, which it thought was appropriate in holding government's feet to the fire over overall level of ambition, but not getting too far into the detail of prescribing policies towards those goals. Which is a tricky line to walk, particularly when like a target implies a lot of policy that at a certain, well, one, courts may not be well placed to make judgments about, but which may just at some point become impractical to implement. The other thing was with those sectoral targets, there was a suggestion in there that there's signs governments may respond to court decisions or litigation about sectoral targets by just avoiding making sectoral commitments in such a specific way.
Or removing them from existing legislative frameworks.
Yeah.
Which was the suggestion about what might happen in Germany. Is that right?
Yeah.
And Australia has got some climate framework legislation, and so do the states variously. So I wonder if we're going to see cases of this sort. I guess it depends on whether we're on track to targets in those various bits of legislation.
What's really interesting to note when you look at these cases specifically at government frameworks is also a sort of increased trend that a lot of these cases are rights-based. So they're really invoking, in many cases, the country's constitution or human rights. And making their case on those grounds. I thought even though this report is very US centric in terms of probably where the data that they've got better access to comes from and things like that, they did note that in parts of the global south, like in India, you haven't seen a huge amount of litigation, but they just recently had a landmark judgment in their Supreme Court, and that decision establishes a new constitutional right to be free from the adverse effects of climate change, and it draws on different articles of their constitution, the fundamental right to life and personal liberty and the fundamental right to equality. So it's interesting when you note a development like that, we're probably very likely to see increasing amounts of litigation in that country now that precedent's been set. So likely to see more of that kind of stuff in countries that are now establishing that precedent, and maybe more in the global south from here on out as well.
And the Indian case had a really interesting and slightly, I feel very ambivalent about it, fact situation where it originated with efforts to protect the great Indian bustard, a much-loved and increasingly rare bird, which advocates believed was threatened by the growth of overhead power transmission lines in India. So they sought to block those power lines, and the Indian government said, but we need to deploy these power lines in order to grow renewable energy and respond to climate change. And the court is trying to navigate these different values and see which ones it can actually incorporate validly into its ruling. And it seems like a mess.
I guess we'll have to read next year's report to see how that shakes out. The other thing that I think you've got to bear in mind when you read these, I think it's appropriate to call them snapshots, because they reflect, like, they're talking about cases that have been brought on since 2015, and some of those are still in courts, right? And they may have had a decision made, but then there's obviously appeal processes that can be gone through. So they're acknowledging, like, in a given year, it is just a snapshot, and some of these things can be reversed over time as well.
All right.
One
category down.
I
think we might need to pick up the pace here, gang.
All right.
That's not a very legal attitude, Luke.
No, but that was a super interesting one.
It was.
I agree.
It was.
Yeah.
And we're billing this podcast by the hour.
That's right.
Next cab off the rank, they have characterised as integrating climate considerations, which is, most regularly turns up in the context of fossil fuel licensing and whether that has been done appropriately. And I think it's useful to note in this context that sometimes the grounds for suit are not necessarily, because of climate change you shouldn't be doing this. It's actually an attempt to slow the process down, to find any reason possible to make life as difficult as possible for the fossil fuel companies progressing their application and the licensing for their facility, in the hope that eventually they'll get sick of it, or, community sentiment will turn against them, and it never goes ahead. And so that's a pretty explicit strategy that's been employed in some cases to great effect.
Yeah. Well, to great notice. If there's one thing that is high profile, it is big campaigns against big projects. I think there is a question mark, and I think the authors explicitly question what the actual real world impact of all these cases is. They're not saying they're a bad idea. They're just saying it's actually very hard to tell what the impact is, and not just for those that aren't resolved yet. There was huge energy in the fight in the United States against various pipelines and fossil developments over the past decade. And those were very potent organising events and getting a lot of people focused on climate stuff. But also, the United States has never produced more oil and gas than it is producing today. So case unresolved.
Well, that actually brings up a useful distinction that they make in the course of categorising these cases. There's not just the ones that are climate aligned and others that are non-climate aligned. The climate aligned ones are, the actively pursuing goals that would see, efforts on mitigation and adaptation accelerate. Not climate aligned are cases that have the opposite effect, that slow down action on that front, whether intentionally or not. And we'll get into some of that detail a little bit later on. It's not always the case that suits in that category are intentionally trying to slow down climate action. They might be quite sympathetic to climate action, but for other reasons have the effect of slowing it down. But there's this other vector, right, which is whether the cases are strategic or not. And to your point, Tennant, they acknowledge that in some instances, whether you win or lose the case may actually not be, the primary consideration. or not the only consideration in engaging in litigation. It could be part of a much broader, multifaceted campaign to raise the profile or to degrade social license or any number of other things that an advocacy group or groups might be pursuing. And it's just one tool in the toolbox, which is why it makes it so hard to assess whether the effort has been successful, because the success of legal proceedings is just one narrow element in these strategic cases.
Yeah, I think that's right. My one other observation about the integrating climate cases is they didn't mention any instances in which people are trying to intervene legally in decision-making processes to say that they ought to approve something or speed something up because of climate considerations. It's not to say there might not be such a case, but they didn't bring any to our attention. It sounds like it's all climate considerations are why we should slow bad things down rather than speed good things up.
Yeah, but I mean, that may well just have been the focus of what they chose to talk about in this report, though.
That's true.
There was one
or what even makes its way into the database.
Yeah. Yeah. So there was one example they gave. It was a Norwegian case, and it was brought on by Greenpeace, I think, against Ministry of Petroleum and Energy. And the ruling that was given this January in Oslo ruled in favour of the plaintiff, who had challenged the approval of some North Sea oil and gas fields, and they'd sued them for disregarding Scope 3 emissions and looking at the eventual, burning of the oil by others. And so the ruling that they've been given is now going to force, I guess, the government to go and redo its environmental assessment and take into account the Scope 3 emissions of those projects, which is interesting to see if that will catch on a little more broadly. One would think the implications of that could be pretty big.
They could well be.
All right. Polluter pays. You mentioned this before, Frankie.
I did. So this is where, cases are seeking monetary damages from defendants based on their alleged contribution to harm caused by climate, and they're either seeking contribution to the cost of adaptation or compensation for loss and damage. They bring up the loss and damage fund that's been the subject of negotiations at the COP, as well as a broader context for some of this. One of the points in this section that I thought was particularly interesting was where they talk about, is it right that you could, be in a country like the US and you sort of be well-resourced enough to take, I don't know, a big oil company or whatever to court and claim damages, and then be able to spread the damages that you receive from that to those people affected in that community. Whereas in other parts of the world, in parts of the global south particularly, which are experiencing the impacts of climate more acutely than others, they're not in a position to be bringing cases like that and taking these, companies or government actors, or whoever to court. So it brings in quite an important question about how you do this in an equitable way. And I guess, that I just felt like it made the point actually very well about why this is a big multilateral conversation, because not every, jurisdiction, or affected party has an equal opportunity to, to seek loss and damage, as is the case in some places.
Yeah, and there's been such an emphasis in the long discussions at the UNFCCC about loss and damage on advanced economies generally and the US in particular, to the extent that they have conceded the need for funding and action and help with loss and damage to say at all times this is not an admission of liability and we're not establishing a claims for compensation precedent. But the US can take that attitude internationally. It can't do that to its own states. The legal pathway is clearer to that kind of claim for compensation, not against the US federal government, but against US-based oil and gas businesses. But yeah, that does raise this huge inequity issue. And like if Vermont or whoever wins a big judgment, are they going to tip some of that into the loss and damage fund to help the small island states or whoever? Like maybe, but it probably wouldn't be very popular in Vermont to do that.
What I found really interesting in this context was some of the examples of someone in a developing country suing a fossil fuel company in a developed country and succeeding in achieving standing. Well, the one I was thinking about was the one in Germany, Lulu versus REE, which is the largest coal-burning power company in Germany. And it is all about, what is the liability for climate damage in Peru caused by a melting glacier. And that's been tracking along up to and including the court making a trip to Peru to examine the glacier. So, that's interesting. And there's a few examples of that sort of peppered through the report of these cross-jurisdictional suits, and to degrees that they gain traction, that could open up pathways for compensation that haven't really been closely considered to date.
It's also fair to say that not many of these cases have kind of reached a conclusion yet, right? Like lots of them are still very much in the works.
Absolutely the case. All right. What do we got next? Corporate framework.
It sounds so exciting. So corporate framework cases actually are exciting or terrifying for depending on who you are. These are cases where plaintiffs are trying to shift the investment orientation or the governance or the actions of a large corporate. So there have been cases brought against Shell to say, well, you're not meeting your decarbonisation targets. There's been a case brought against Fonterra, the New Zealand-based dairy behemoth, to try and get them to rapidly reduce emissions, which might. Well, it's hard to see how they would rapidly do that, but that's what the ongoing legal action is about. These have not had any definitive victories so far, but there have been partial wins along the way, as well as some getting knocked back. And this is something where, together with the transition risk and the climate washing categories we'll come to in a sec, we're probably going to see an uptick of litigation efforts around here with the growth of climate-related financial disclosures by businesses. So you can sort of understand some of the nerves and some of the argy-bargy about partial immunity or can only ASIC bring some cases, please, rather than anybody with a complaint. That has been part of the argument about those disclosures in Australia.
So this category, for me, I read very closely to a couple of others that appear later on around transition risk and then climate washing. And what's interesting is that I think transition risk is a new category, like that they've sort of broken it out probably from this area because of the growth of cases. And, I think probably very much driven by that push for more transparent mandatory forms of disclosure as well. But it goes to that responsibility of directors to manage those transition risks, and they've sort of seen enough of it in the last couple of years that they think it merits its own category. But there's one that comes before that I don't want to skip over because it was still really interesting, and that was the failure to adapt And this is not a huge, area of litigation. I think of the 2,500 climate cases around the world, only a bit over 200 touch on the issue of adaptation. And most of them have been in the US and apparently Australia as well. This is really around cases that are alleging either that a government or a company has a responsibility to introduce adaptation members, or either of those actors has failed to do this in a way that they should have. And like one example that was given, I think would be true in many other places around the world. It was the case of Northwest Environmental Defense Center versus the Federal Emergency Management Agencies. This is in the US. And they challenged the implementation of a national flood insurance program in Oregon on the basis that it had incentivized developments in flood-prone areas and that they'd put those people at risk. So essentially, rather than looking at the risk and going, well, it's not suitable to have development happening in these areas, we're going to put, it may have been a reinsurance program in place to make it easy or easier for people to still build there. And they've sort of signalled that as a failure to adapt case. And like that will be true in a lot of places. I can think of several places in Australia where something like that could be happening.
And they also mentioned in this category early litigation regarding the rights to protection of climate refugees, which is a topic that we can expect to come up with increasing frequency around the world in countries that climate refugees might flee to, like Australia.
Yep.
Okay. I think we've covered corporate framework and transition risk. Did we want to say anything about climate washing?
Rapid growth in this category is going on. Lots of cases being brought against companies that are said to have over-egged their pudding when it comes to representing their climate credentials. The authors are they're cautious in a lot of places about characterising the effects of litigation, but they're particularly cautious here in saying we just don't know what impact all this emphasis on climate washing is going to have, which I think it is good to be cautious there. Because, I mean, you can absolutely point to egregious instances of companies passing off like the merest gesture at emissions reduction as a comprehensive world-leading plan. There's also a strong element of people sticking their head above the parapet to try and do something and getting roundly beaten up for it because it's not a complete solution. We're definitely going to see more of this, but maybe some care and caution is warranted.
I thought it interesting that this seemed to be one of the categories of litigation with the highest success rate. They're saying that 70% of the 77 cases that they tracked had concluded in favour of the claimant. And I wonder whether that's because it's sort of leaning on much more well-established law.
Yep.
In terms of just, truth in advertising and the like. And also like the materiality of the issues at stake. Like you've been saying stuff that's wrong, you've got to stop saying it, and then there might be some damages that get paid out. It's just the stakes are lower, so it's easier for courts to take a stand.
I think that's right.
It's not discussed in this paper, but and I don't know that we'd ever necessarily see it crop up, but I was in a meeting just in a work context, and there's obviously in corporate Australia lots of conversation around greenwashing, and now that obviously ASIC is resourced up and willing to move on people for making false claims. I'd heard that there's also legal advice floating out there, and it's called green hushing, where you would think that the sort of the natural reaction to this push is for companies then to just shut up and not say much of anything about what they're doing, even if they are getting on. with action. But even that can be viewed as problematic as well when you choose to be quiet. So, this is a very tricky landscape for corporates to navigate.
And, just to get all reflective about the whole of this for a sec, I sort of wonder if one major impact of all this litigation is going to be decision makers, whether they're government or corporate, doing what they do, policy development, consideration of investments or of approvals of projects, doing those things increasingly with an eye to covering their asses in future litigation rather than in actually making good or timely decisions. And, ideally covering your ass in litigation would align you to good outcomes and substantively good process. But I think we all see many instances where, in all kinds of fields, where ass covering and legal obligation fulfilling is a highly time and resource intensive, sham. Where people's time is taken, but nothing is actually different at the end of that process. And it'd be really bad for that to be the way that doesn't need to be how this plays out. And a lot of these cases have immense value because they're huge injustices sought to be remedied. But the legal system doesn't always produce a shining and efficient resolution.
Well, there's also a timescale question here, right? Because often the way that the law works is that there is a process of, testing things in courts and unresolved questions being worked through and precedents being set in some of these areas, particularly in the corporate space. One would expect in 3 to 5 years, let's talk in an Australian context, there's going to be a lot more clarity and confidence about what directors' rights are and aren't, and kind of the risk profile around, litigation that could arise from a failure to uphold directors' duties in relation to climate risk. But we're working through this messy process in the interim. You've seen the government try to address that with the implementation of the climate-related financial disclosure legislation by limiting the ability to sue in some areas for a period of time.
Well, so by the time this episode goes to air, the climate-related financial disclosures legislation could have been legislated, although I guess on my track record so far, me saying that could be the kiss of death. But we should all have a look at the form in which it does pass when it does, because, those provisions around partial exemption, limited immunity from prosecution will be fought down to the wire, I think.
Okay. Well, in the climate-aligned litigation category, we have one more subcategory, which is turning off the taps, which is where the finance to non-aligned activities is challenged.
Yeah. And it's not a lot of cases. And
No.
They didn't have a huge amount to say about it.
Although there was an Australian one.
That's true.
In the mix as well. I think it was Jubilee versus EFA, who I'm not sure of that organisation, and NAIF, the
Export Finance Australia.
Right.
And the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility.
One of the most black box type organisations going around. So I think the claim was the organisation hadn't been forthcoming with a lot of its reports, right? Its sort of environmental impact assessment reports and things like that. Not a lot of material was being published out in the open, and that's using taxpayer money as well. Interesting to see where that one lands.
All right, we've dealt with all the lightsaber-wielding Jedi running around trying to progress climate action. Now we turn to the dark side. Cases not aligned with climate.
And some troubled Jedi considering whether their friends are not their own worst enemies.
That is true. So, shall we cover ESG backlash? This was an interesting one, and then one of the really fascinating themes that emerged for me in this report, where a bunch of people that perhaps aren't so jazzed about this whole climate action thing have been observing what activists have been achieving with climate-aligned litigation, and go, well, two can play at that game, can't they?
Yeah. And there is a very organised conservative legal movement in the United States with academics and NGOs with considerable financial backing, companies and a political party and its office holders closely involved in it, pushing back on lots of things and taking extremely strategic action to, for instance, take control of the Supreme Court for decades to come. And they are absolutely bringing that mindset to the pushback on ESG. They know strategy.
So what the fascinating kind of theme that I saw crop up in a few of these cases, you know, a lot in the US, right, were around the plaintiffs accusing either companies under the Employee Retirement Income Security Act or on behalf of pension funds for considering climate as part of their investment strategy and not, you know, in just sole pursuit of maximising investment returns without considering those things. That was very interesting. I think that came up in an American Airlines case, as well as I think BlackRock being sued by some people as well. I think the Tennessee Attorney General suing BlackRock.
Yes.
Well, it's so fascinating because it's like, you know, arguing that there's a potential breach of directors' duties and particularly fiduciary duties by not giving absolute primacy to the responsibility to shareholders to maximise returns.
Yep.
And the philosophical framework which this is being prosecuted through is one that sees that it as a zero-sum game. If you are pursuing ESG outcomes, you are necessarily lowering returns. Of course, if you take a more strategic view of the impacts of climate change, ignoring the risks associated with climate change could be an absolutely diabolically terrible strategy if you're interested in the long-term returns of your shareholders. So the starting premise, the worldview that one brings to these questions is very important for how one considers these, because there'd be many in the investor community that say, well, actually, even if you take a very narrow view and in terms of your responsibility to shareholders, we need to take climate change super, super seriously, even from just a narrow self-interested perspective.
Yeah. But there is a long history of extremely narrow interpretations of fiduciary duties in the United States, and there's very cogent arguments that this is just a misinterpretation of the actual law in the US, and that there is absolutely scope to take a broader view of the interests of shareholders. But that is not the animating view behind the litigation by states like Tennessee and Texas and others who have pushed back very, very hard against woke capital.
Well, I think what we can say, Tennant, is that today's misinterpretation of the law is tomorrow's Supreme Court ruling when it comes to the United States.
Oh, I was going to spotlight the SEC new rules on climate-related disclosures, because that was that was a monumental, shift in the US. So they introduced these like pretty significant updates to its disclosure requirements for both US and international companies operating in the US to report on, material climate-related risks, their governance, risk management processes, their scope 1 and 2 material emissions, and sort of any voluntary goals and transition plans. So this change is like 900 pages of very technical detail. I think I read there's something like 24,000 submissions to their consultation. I think within 10 days, it being introduced, 9 cases were filed against it.
From everybody. Everybody's upset. Environmental groups, oil companies, the Chamber of Commerce, state attorneys general, and from, I think, all different directions, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's
who'd be a US policymaker?
Oh my God. I just read
You'd have to have a love of seeing the interior of courtrooms.
You would. That's where that's going to be stuck for some time, one would think.
So this is a fun acronym, but definitely unfun in terms of its chilling effect on the public square. Strategic litigation against public participation, or SLAPP cases. Frankie,
you've been slapped.
You've been slapped. Oi. Like, I didn't realise there was a term for these kind of cases until I read this. Like, why have we not been using this hilarious acronym all along? But if we could summarise, it's where, you're not necessarily trying to win a case necessarily, but you're trying to intimidate, silence, exhaust the resources, of people who would oppose you. So they're more commonly an abusive legal process that involves a lot of expensive and mostly meritless litigation by very well-resourced companies against the poor old NGOs who are trying to bring these cases against them. And it's just an attempt to exhaust their resourcing and force them to give up, basically. That's awful. But we hear about these kind of cases all the time. So
yeah. And the authors don't have their own figures on this, but they cite others who reckon that 152 climate-related SLAPP cases have been brought in the last decade, which sounds to me, that sounds like a lot. That's a lot of slaps.
Yep. Look, I was a little unfair in categorising all of these as emerging from the dark side. There are these sort of murky cases that round out this category. Just transition cases is one of them. Cases brought by groups that are, in their view, being negatively affected by the transition to a net zero economy and want their rights recognised, want to be taken care of in some way, shape or form. So they're not necessarily against the direction of travel or the broad policy ambition, but they are concerned about how that ambition is being achieved.
Yeah, and this is one, along with the next category, where in some ways the intention may be completely independent of the effect. Like very well intended interventions may have the effect of slowing stuff down a lot, slowing down efforts to adapt and prepare, or slowing down mitigation. Moving at the speed of court may not be consistent with 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees. But when there are policies like demolishing houses in extreme flood risk areas, people are going to push back by whatever means they feel they can deploy.
the final category or subcategory in these non-aligned climate litigations is green-on-green cases, which is broadly where there's a competing environmental imperative that intersects in an unhelpful way with, action on climate change. The classic in this case is, the rollout of large-scale renewables or transmission lines, and there being biodiversity or other environmental impacts of that rollout, and folk that are very concerned about those impacts launching litigation to prevent those impacts taking place.
The transmission sort of use that you referenced there seems to be pretty common, as well as offshore wind, and that there's like a very organised anti-offshore wind kind of network of groups. Like this is sort of specifically commenting on the case in the US, but just observing that like this network of organisations often employs misinformation. They have a pretty broad range of groups that they're dealing with, from like grassroots organisations who are motivated by conservation concerns, but also people who have a past involvement with climate change denial, and they're, I guess, harnessing what may be very understandable concerns on the one half, and really weaponizing misinformation against the rollout of renewables in that category. What is it about offshore wind that gets people particularly? I don't know. That always surprises me a little bit.
Yeah, like the theory of the part of the push for offshore wind, say 3 or 4 years ago, was these are going to be out of sight and out of mind, and they'll be a great hedge against grumpy people onshore. Not wanting more wind farms on land, and that hasn't worked out that way.
And find a whole new category of grumpy people to annoy. And look, and the thing that's murky about this is exactly what you said, Frankie, is that there are very likely bad faith actors looking to razz people up, and there's like genuine community concerns that need to be engaged with. It's a very unfortunate development. So, climate litigation, hot or not?
Closing arguments.
Well, there's a lot of it, and it's pretty interesting, even if it's not growing as fast as it was. The authors aren't exactly sure why. They offer some theories, and maybe the next wave of growth of these cases is coming. But it's pretty important. Like, policies are getting rewritten as a result. Companies are defending themselves or going on the assault as a result of it. It is definitely something we need to have on our radar more than I did.
Well, just the trend in litigation against corporates is not surprising but interesting. We didn't talk about this, but the kinds of actors being sued also, I think, is evolving as well. So, yes, there's this focus on the climate majors, the big fossil fuel companies around the world. But there has been this increasing shift to look at litigation against insurance companies or professional services companies that enable the activities of those other big ones. So that kind of chain of people involved, I think, would be giving the broader kind of corporate community a lot of pause for thought around who you do business with, right?
Incidentally, I hated the climate measures thing. The data set there is, it's a best efforts thing, but it's ascribing all emissions to the producer of the original fossil fuel.
Yeah.
and saying, oh, wow, look, it's a very small number of entities that are causing climate change, which I think is deeply misleading to people. But the other thing is that list makes it clear, like most of the majors, most of the emissions captured by that language are state-owned entities in developing and emerging economies, and very few of those, as we said a little earlier on, are subject to any kind of litigation or legal restraint. There are not a lot of cases in the database. I think the number might be zero that are pushing back on Chinese state-owned coal businesses, for example.
I think in terms of the future trends, the two things that stood out to me was the idea that success begets success. So where there's a trend in litigation, that is noticed both within particular jurisdictions and around the world, and it spurs further endeavours along that same track. The other one was, some speculation around whether some of the slowdown in terms of the growth of cases is actually a consolidation of effort, and activists and other players in this space actually working more closely together and better resourcing a smaller number of more impactful cases rather than, spraying their letters of demand all across the countryside, which would be interesting if that is indeed what's occurring. But I would say the future trend section of this is high on speculation and low on data. There's a bit of rumination and crystal ball gazing going on in that section of the paper.
I agree with that characterisation.
But what does Chewy reckon, Frankie?
Chewy's asleep. He's now bored. I think he conked out.
Litigated until submission follows.
Finally.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we'll share something that is currently captivating our attention. And I'll kick us off with some feedback we received on our last episode about Highway to Hell, the new quarterly essay from Joelle Gerges. Now, we all had all kinds of thoughts about this essay, but one thought that you had, Frankie, related to the need to think carefully about how we replace the government revenue associated with fossil fuel exports. And I think you were especially interested in how we do that through the lens of how we maintain public services and the social safety net that we're all accustomed to. Is that a fair characterisation?
Yeah, I think I have a continuing interest / obsession with the idea of wanting to see some deep thinking about like what a Australian budget looks like in 2050. Like, where are the new sources of revenue? What are we spending more money on in 2050 that we are now? So I have just an intellectual interest in that.
Okay, so we got some feedback on this point from a long-time listener, David McEwen, who pointed us to a pithy little paper on Australian government revenues from fossil fuels and shared the following thoughts. The question of what we would replace fossil fuel revenue with becomes easier to answer if you consider what fossil fuels actually contribute to the public purse. The best analysis I have been able to find to answer that is in the linked 2023 report. Its conclusion is that our fossil fuel industry delivers a comparatively paltry less than 3% of combined state, territory and federal revenue. As an employer, the sector is around or less than 1% of the workforce, depending on whose definition of supporting jobs you believe. Around 2% of Australian bank loans go to fossil fuels. On the share market, the fossil-dominated energy index is currently languishing at 3.3% of the ASX. That doesn't sound to me like the indispensable economic juggernaut the fossil fuel industry is claimed to be. In any case, if the government stopped new fossil approvals, there would be a fairly gentle glide path, given that existing approvals run out to the 2070s. Plenty of time to build out the clean energy superpower. End quote. So, What do you reckon, Frankie? Are you feeling more sanguine about the impact of fossil fuel phase-out on government coffers after this intervention from David?
I mean, it's a great paper, and I'll make sure it's linked to in the show notes. Yeah, I mean, I would admit to not being super familiar with the numbers before I had a read of this, and I think my comment back to David was definitely lacking some nuance in the pod episode, because there was no investigation or thinking about any of the detail in the essay, so we're probably more reacting to that in our chat. But this is really interesting, and I think having had a look at the paper, all of David's quoted stats there are spot on. It is interesting to notice within, that sort of small role where more of the dependencies are. So I think if you look across the country, there's more money going to the Queensland government through coal royalties, for example.
I have been getting an incredible number of ads in my podcast stream from the Queensland government telling me how great coal royalties are.
Yeah,
it's a stunning indictment of the algorithm, because why do I need this marketed at me? But they seem to think they're great.
Oh, there you go. So there was that one. And then, the one that's kind of often talked about nationally is the fuel excise tax, which is probably the biggest chunk of change in the federal purse that will need replacing. So I'm very fair cop from David, and I think I guess the nuance that I'd want to see kind of explored, in the next iteration of a conversation like this is, okay, well, what's the plan for Queensland? And they've, obviously got their own plans about renewables and things like that. Are their plans going to compensate for that? Hopefully, loss of royalties into the future. And equally, we've talked about road user charging on this pod before, and those. They're fraught topics, because you've got to think about when you introduce the thing that's going to replace the income that you're currently getting, say, from fuel excise. There's a lot of criticism of the Victorian government, who was sued. Wasn't it deemed unconstitutional for putting in?
I wonder if that's in the database.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think it is.
I should go look at that. But a lot of the punters at the time were saying that it was premature to introduce a tax like that before EVs had really taken off, and it was acting as a disincentive. So really welcomed the feedback from David, and I'll make sure the paper's shared. Yeah.
My quick thought on this is just that it is absolutely easy to exaggerate the economic importance of the coal and gas sectors. But even a more modest appraisal is 3% of total receipts. Replacing that, it actually does require some actions that will cause some consternation for somebody. And even if we put that in proportion, it takes some delicate doing. Worth some thought.
Well, if you want to tell us the things Frankie, or indeed any of us, got wrong on this episode of the podcast, and I guarantee these three Bush lawyers got probably more than one thing wrong, you know where to go. Point your electronic mail to mailbag@letmesumup.net. Tennant, what have you got?
I have a quick and thematically resonant note about the nature positive reforms which the federal government has been pursuing, and who knows what will have happened by the time this episode goes to air. But I am going to depressedly venture out on a limb and say I don't think these reforms are going anywhere anytime soon. These are the changes to national environmental approvals. The government has broken them up into stages. Stage 2 is about establishing an independent EPA and otherwise not monkeying with any of the content of what project approvals is about, and establishing an information agency on environmental matters as well. And then stage 3 is when all the curly stuff about streamlining decision-making, or some argue let's have a climate trigger or something else to make it much harder for new fossil projects to get approved. And it really, like after recent Senate hearings, we will see what happens, but my sense is everybody hates it, each other and themselves, and
that's not what we want.
Nothing's going to happen until after the election, depending on the numbers, and even then, maybe not. Some people have convinced themselves that improvement is the worst thing ever, actually, and an independent EPA is the worst thing ever because you need ministers to take a broader view and approve things. I can remember a few ministers taking a narrower view and blocking projects like great big wind farms or whatever else for fundamentally political reasons. But anyway, people have made that judgment. And Greens, large and small g, seem to be prioritising stopping bad things over speeding good things. And I think it's just stuck in the mud for a while to come. Hopefully I am as wrong about this as I have been about others.
Maybe you could employ that new litigation strategy you invented early in the podcast of suing people for not approving things.
Sounds great. Yes. Bring it on. Lawyers, come talk to me.
All right. So, Frankie, do you have one more thing?
I have a little shout out to a really great little Instagram account called... and you can look this up as the handle, Jen Lish Fix It Chicks. It's the Insta of two fabulous women. At least one will be known to us, Jenny Edwards, one of the founders of the Facebook group My Efficient Electric Home. She's also very well-known energy efficiency home retrofit expert, and Lish Faher, who is also a journo for the ABC. So they've done this fun little Insta where they just make little reels talking about energy efficiency hacks for your home, and it's great fun. I ran into them both at a electrification event at Parliament House last week that David Pocock had organised, and it was always delightful to see Jenny, but I got to meet Lish, and they were cheering my ear off about their little old Insta that's got 30,000 plus followers, so it's great. It's a really great little account, so everyone should check it out.
This is a burgeoning subgenre on Instagram, and another one in this category that I follow is Electrify This, which sounds very similar to what Jenny is doing, but I didn't know she was doing the Insta thing. That's very exciting.
It's really cool. I'll link to it in the show notes.
Okay, that is our show for today. So, as I said, look, if there are questions, comments, concerns, but ideally papers you want to put on our radar, you should get them into mailbag at letmesumup.net. We didn't mention it at the top of the show, Frankie. We have a Patreon. What the hell's going on there?
So much sweet, delicious boko is going on over there, guys. You can go listen to our subscriber-only bonus episodes. There's a few of those now. We did one not too long ago about what the fork in the road with US politics means for climate action over in the US. So that was a great old chat.
I think that with the previous spruiking of that episode, we leaned into characterising it as the staring into the abyss, but we spent a good 20 minutes talking about what Kamala Harris's policies might be in this space. And as, you know, the polls continue to surprisingly improve for the Democratic ticket, starting to think through what her priorities might be in this space and what drives her and, you know, what we can ascribe to her positions in 2020 versus 2024. All that's kind of good to be across. So if you're interested in any of that, it's worth checking out that episode.
Although, again, we don't know what will have happened between now and when you listen to this episode. So if protests at the Democratic convention destroy the city of Chicago and it all turns topsy-turvy, then listen to the back half of that episode for what will come.
It's a multi-purpose episode, useful in all circumstances.
That's right. Definitely don't sue us.
Yes, no writs in the Let Me Sum Up mailbag, please.
Please don't slap us.
And Tenet. We don't just have a Patreon, we have a website. What's there?
Well, if you have been sued into penury for climate-related reasons and can no longer afford to back the Patreon, you can find free episodes of this podcast at letmesumup.net. All the free episodes. They're great.
So many episodes. That's been a lot of fun. But we're done for now. For Frankie Muscovich and Lieutenant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you again soon.